The sound of gunshots echoed through Cottonwood Springs like a death knell as Florence Miller ducked beneath the rough, hewn oak table, her widow's black skirts bunched around her trembling knees. The saloon had erupted into chaos mere moments before cards scattered, whiskey spilled, and men diving for cover as Jasper Thornton and his gang burst through the swinging doors. She shouldn't have been there in the first place, a respectable widow in a saloon, but desperation had driven her to seek out the establishment's owner about a cleaning position. Now shame burned hotter than fear as she cowered beneath the table, praying no one from town would recognize her. Florence pressed a hand to her mouth, stifling a sob as boots stomped past her hiding place. The hem of her dress had caught on a nail, and she tugged it free, terrified of discovery. 6 months a widow, and here she was, hiding in a saloon during a robbery like some common saloon girl. What would people say? Everyone stay down. Thornton bellowed, firing another shot into the ceiling. This'll go quick if nobody plays hero. The floorboards vibrated as someone approached her table. Florence squeezed her eyes shut, her heart hammering against her ribs like a wild Mustang fighting capture. She could smell tobacco, leather, and gunpowder scents that reminded her painfully of Thomas, her late husband. The table above her suddenly shifted, and light flooded her hiding place. Florence gasped, looking up into the most startling blue eyes she'd ever seen. They belonged to a tall man with sun-bronzed skin and a weathered face that spoke of years under the harsh western sun. He wore no bandana to mark him as one of the outlaws. Well now, he drawled softly, extending a calloused hand toward her. Reckon this ain't the safest spot for you, madam. Florence shrank back. Please, she whispered, mortified. I can't be seen here. Understanding flickered in those blue eyes. Without hesitation, he shrugged off his duster and held it out. Take my hand. You belong with me. Something in his quiet confidence made Florence reach for him. His fingers closed around hers, warm and strong, as he helped her from beneath the table and swiftly draped the coat around her shoulders, obscuring her identity. Name's Wade Calloway, he murmured close to her ear as gunfire erupted again. And I believe we'd best be making our exit, madam. The year was 1876, and Florence Miller's life was about to change forever. Wade kept one protective arm around Florence's shoulders as he guided her toward the back door of the saloon, his body positioned between her and the ongoing chaos. The outlaws were focused on emptying the cash register and relieving patrons of their valuables, paying little attention to the pair slipping away. Keep your head down, Wade instructed, his breath warm against her ear. Almost there. Florence clutched the oversized duster around her frame, grateful for the concealment it provided. The shame of being discovered in such an establishment would destroy what little standing she had left in Cottonwood Springs. As a widow with dwindling funds and no family, her reputation was her only currency. They reached the back door, and Wade eased it open, checking the alley beyond before ushering her through. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows between the buildings, and the distant mountains loomed purple against the darkening sky. Thank you, Florence managed once they were safely outside, her voice barely audible over the pounding of her heart. She attempted to remove his coat, but he stopped her with a gentle hand. Best keep that on till we're well away from here, Mrs. Miller. Florence Miller. She hesitated. I'm not what you might think. I was only there to inquire about employment. Wade's expression remained neutral, but kindness softened his eyes. What folks think ain't my concern, Mrs. Miller. Getting you home safely is. A gunshot from inside made them both startle. Wade took her elbow and guided her deeper into the alley. Where do you live? The small white house at the end of Sycamore Street, Florence replied, hurrying to match his long strides. But I can't be seen returning from this direction. The gossips will take the long way, Wade assured her, leading her behind the livery stable. I know these back ways better than most. Florence studied him surreptitiously as they walked. He wasn't wearing a sheriff's badge, but there was an air of authority about him nonetheless. His tanned face bore the lines of a man who smiled often, though he wasn't smiling now. A faded scar ran along his jawline, disappearing into the collar of his shirt. You're not from Cottonwood Springs, she observed, certain she would have remembered him. Just passing through, Wade confirmed. Been driving cattle up from Texas. Stopped to resupply before heading north to Montana Territory. A cattleman, then. Florence felt a pang of memory. Thomas had been a rancher before pneumonia took him last winter, leaving her with debts she couldn't pay and skills that had little value in town. They wound through several more alleys before emerging onto Sycamore Street from a direction that wouldn't raise eyebrows. Florence's modest home stood at the end, a small, white clapboard structure with faded blue shutters and a sagging porch. Once it had seemed charming. Now it represented her precarious circumstances. "This is me," she said, stopping at her gate. She slipped off his duster and handed it back, suddenly conscious of her disheveled appearance. "Thank you, Mr. Calloway. Your kindness won't be forgotten." Wade accepted his coat, but made no move to leave. He glanced at her house, then back at her face, seeming to read something there that Florence would rather have kept hidden. "Pardon my forwardness, Mrs. Miller, but are you managing all right?" The unexpected question brought a flush to her cheeks. Pride warred with honesty as she clutched her reticule tighter. "I'm adjusting to widowhood as best one can," she replied stiffly. Wade's gaze remained steady. "That wasn't what I asked." Florence looked away, unwilling to admit to a stranger what she could barely acknowledge to herself. She was 3 months behind on property taxes, had sold most of her jewelry, and if she didn't find employment soon, she'd lose the house. "I'll manage," she said finally. Wade nodded, respecting her reticence. He reached into his pocket and withdrew a business card, holding it out to her. "I'm staying at the Grand Hotel for 2 more days before heading north. If you find yourself in need of assistance, Mrs. Miller, don't hesitate to call on me." Florence accepted the card, though she had no intention of using it. "That's very kind, but unnecessary." A slight smile curved his lips. "Kindness is never unnecessary, madam." He tipped his hat. "Good evening to you." As Wade Calloway walked away, Florence couldn't help but watch his retreating figure, tall and straight-backed against the setting sun. She tucked his card into her pocket before pushing open her gate and heading inside, telling herself that the fluttering in her stomach was merely the aftermath of a frightening situation, nothing more. Inside her empty house, Florence leaned against the closed door and exhaled slowly. The silence that had once been so oppressive after Thomas's death now felt like a sanctuary after the chaos of the saloon. She moved through the familiar rooms, lighting lamps against the gathering darkness, trying to push away thoughts of Wade Calloway's perceptive blue eyes. She had encountered many men since becoming a widow, some helpful, others predatory, but none had affected her quite like this stranger who'd pulled her from beneath a table and declared, "You belong with me." The words echoed in her mind, stirring something she'd thought long buried beneath grief and worry. Florence shook her head, chiding herself for such fanciful thoughts. She had far more pressing concerns than a handsome cowboy passing through town. Tomorrow she would try the millinery shop for employment. Mrs. Henderson had mentioned needing help with the spring hats, and Florence's needlework was exceptional. As she prepared a simple supper of bread and cheese, a knock at her door startled her. Visitors were rare these days. Most of her so-called friends had drifted away after Thomas's death, especially once it became clear that his affairs weren't in the order he'd claimed. Florence smoothed her hair and straightened her dress before opening the door. Her stomach dropped when she recognized Horatio Pinkerton, the bank manager, standing on her porch, his ledger tucked under one arm. "Mrs. Miller," he said, removing his hat. "I apologize for calling so late, but I've been attempting to reach you." "Mr. Pinkerton." Florence forced a polite smile. "Won't you come in?" The bank manager stepped inside, his gaze sweeping critically over the modest furnishings. Several empty spaces on the walls and shelves betrayed where Florence had sold items to make ends meet. "I'll be direct, Mrs. Miller," Pinkerton said, opening his ledger. "The bank can no longer extend your deadline for the property taxes. You're now 3 months delinquent, and I'm afraid we must insist on payment by the end of this week." Florence's knees weakened. "The end of this week? But that's only 3 days away." "Mr. Pinkerton, surely you understand what I understand," he interrupted, "is that business is business. Your husband's debts were considerable, and the bank has been more than generous. If you cannot pay by Friday, we will have no choice but to begin foreclosure proceedings." "And then what becomes of me?" Florence asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Pinkerton adjusted his spectacles, avoiding her gaze. "There are options for women in your situation. My sister runs a boarding house in Denver that sometimes needs help. Or perhaps. He cleared his throat. I understand that Samuel Graves has expressed interest in the property. He's a widower himself, getting on in years, but financially secure. He might be amenable to an arrangement that would allow you to remain. Florence stiffened, understanding perfectly what type of arrangement Pinkerton was suggesting. Samuel Graves was known throughout the county for his wandering hands and cruel temper. His first wife had died under mysterious circumstances, and rumors suggested she'd fallen down the stairs after one of his drunken rages. I believe I'd prefer the boarding house, she said coldly. Pinkerton shrugged. As you wish. But my offer stands only until Friday. He returned his hat to his head. Good evening, Mrs. Miller. I'll see myself out. After he left, Florence sank into a chair, her appetite gone. 3 days. She had 3 days to produce a sum that would take months to earn, even if she found employment immediately. The card Wade Calloway had given her seemed to burn in her pocket, but she pushed away the temptation to seek his help. She had already relied too heavily on Thomas, believing his assurances that he was providing for their future, only to discover after his death that he had gambled away most of their savings. No, she would find another way. She had to. The next morning dawned clear and cool, a typical spring day in the Colorado Territory. Florence dressed with care in her best remaining day dress, a navy blue cotton, with minimal trim that could pass for either morning or everyday wear. She would try the millinery shop first, then the general store, and if necessary, even the school, though she had no teaching experience. As she approached the millinery on Main Street, she noticed a small crowd gathered outside the sheriff's office. Curiosity drew her closer, where she overheard 2 women discussing the previous day's excitement. 3 men dead, including Thornton himself, one whispered. They say a stranger drew faster than lightning when Thornton tried to shoot the barkeep. A Texas cowboy, I heard, the other replied. Sheriff's calling him a hero, but he refused any reward. Just went about his business like it was nothing unusual to gun down 3 outlaws. Florence's heart quickened. Could they be talking about Wade Calloway? She hadn't witnessed the conclusion of the saloon incident, having been whisked away before the worst of the violence. She continued to the millinery, trying to focus on her purpose rather than thoughts of the mysterious cowboy. Mrs. Henderson greeted her warmly enough, but regretfully informed her that she had just that morning hired her niece to help with the spring rush. I'm terribly sorry, Mrs. Miller, she said, genuine sympathy in her eyes. If I'd known you were looking for work. It's quite all right, Florence assured her, hiding her disappointment. Your niece is fortunate to have such an opportunity. The general store yielded similar results, no positions available, and the school had no need for additional help until the fall term. By midday, Florence had exhausted her immediate options and found herself walking toward the hotel where Wade Calloway was staying, his card clutched in her hand. She hesitated outside the Grand Hotel, pride warring with necessity. What exactly did she expect from this man she barely knew? She couldn't possibly ask him for money. Perhaps he might know of employment opportunities with the cattle drive heading north? Women sometimes cooked for such operations, though it would mean leaving Cottonwood Springs behind. Before she could decide whether to enter, the hotel doors swung open, and Wade himself emerged, accompanied by a well-dressed gentleman Florence recognized as Jonathan Ellis, the largest rancher in the county. They were deep in conversation, neither noticing her standing nearby. Florence stepped back, suddenly unsure of herself. Wade looked different today, clean-shaven, wearing a tailored suit rather than trail clothes, his dark hair neatly combed. He looked less like a cowboy and more like a businessman, and the transformation gave her pause. Who exactly was Wade Calloway? As if sensing her presence, Wade glanced up, his conversation faltering when he spotted her. Recognition, and something else pleasure, flickered across his features. Mrs. Miller, he called, excusing himself from Ellis and approaching her. Good day to you. Mr. Calloway, Florence acknowledged, embarrassed to be caught lurking outside his hotel. I was just passing by. Wade's expression suggested he didn't believe her, but he was too much of a gentleman to say so. A fortunate coincidence, then. I was just thinking of calling on you. You were. Florence couldn't mask her surprise. Indeed. He gestured to Ellis, who had remained at a polite distance. Mr. Ellis has been kind enough to show me some properties in the area. I'm considering investing in Colorado ranching opportunities. Florence's brow furrowed. I thought you were driving cattle to Montana. A smile tugged at Wade's lips. I oversee several cattle drives each year, but my primary business is in ranching investments. The drive provided an excellent opportunity to survey potential properties along the way. This revelation shifted Florence's perception of him entirely. Not just a cowboy passing through, but a businessman with means. She wasn't sure why this discovery unsettled her. I see, she said, suddenly conscious of her worn gloves and mended hem. Well, I won't keep you from your business, Mr. Calloway. Wait, Wade said as she turned to leave. I meant what I said about calling on you. Would you do me the honor of dining with me this evening? The hotel restaurant is quite good, I'm told. Florence blinked, taken aback by the invitation. That's very kind, but I couldn't possibly. It would give me great pleasure, Wade interrupted gently. And perhaps ease your mind about being seen with someone who witnessed you in compromising circumstances. His reference to their meeting brought heat to Florence's cheeks, but she recognized the wisdom in his suggestion. If people saw her dining respectably with Mr. Calloway, it might counteract any rumors should someone have noticed her fleeing the saloon. Very well, she conceded. What time shall I arrive? I'll call for you at 6, if that's convenient. Florence nodded, already wondering what she would wear. Her morning clothes were hardly suitable for dining at the Grand Hotel, but she had precious few alternatives. Until this evening, then, Wade said, tipping his hat before rejoining Ellis. Florence walked home with her mind in turmoil. She had sought out Wade hoping for help with her financial predicament, but now found herself accepting a dinner invitation instead. What did he want from her? And more disturbingly, why did the prospect of spending an evening in his company make her heart race in a way it hadn't since she was a young girl? At precisely 6 o'clock, a knock sounded at Florence's door. She had spent the afternoon transforming her best black dress with a collar of lace she'd salvaged from one of her mother's old gowns. The effect wasn't fashionable, exactly, but it softened the severity of the morning attire and brought out the warmth in her brown eyes. She opened the door to find Wade standing on her porch, hat in hand, looking even more handsome than she remembered. He wore a dark suit with a crisp white shirt and silk tie, his boots polished to a high shine. The transformation from the dusty cowboy who had rescued her was complete, yet his eyes held the same kindness. Mrs. Miller, he said, genuine appreciation in his gaze. You look lovely. Thank you, Florence replied, flustered by his directness. You're very punctual. A smile quirked his lips. My father believed tardiness was next to godlessness. Some lessons stick with a man. Wade offered his arm, and Florence accepted it, allowing him to escort her to the waiting carriage of fine rented conveyance rather than the hotel's public transport. The thoughtfulness of this gesture wasn't lost on her. By arriving in a private carriage, they would attract less attention than walking through town together. As they rode the short distance to the hotel, Florence found herself curious about this man who had so unexpectedly entered her life. You mentioned your father. Is your family in Texas? A shadow crossed Wade's face. My parents passed some years ago. Fever took them both within a week of each other. I'm sorry, Florence said softly, understanding all too well the pain of such loss. It was difficult, Wade acknowledged. They left me the family ranch near San Antonio, which became the foundation for my current enterprises. And you, Mrs. Miller? Have you family nearby? Florence shook her head. My parents died when I was young. I was raised by an aunt in Denver, who arranged my marriage to Thomas when I was 18. He brought me to Cottonwood Springs 5 years ago. And no children? Wade asked gently. No, Florence replied, an old grief surfacing briefly. It wasn't God's plan for us, it seems. The carriage arrived at the hotel, where Wade handed her down with careful courtesy. Several townspeople were entering and exiting the establishment, and Florence noticed their curious glances. By morning, everyone would know that Widow Miller had dined with the wealthy Texan. The hotel restaurant was the finest in Cottonwood Springs, with white tablecloths, crystal glassware, and a menu that featured delicacies rarely seen in the small town. Wade secured them a table near the window, where the setting sun cast a golden glow across their faces. Once they were seated and had ordered Wade recommending the beef tenderloin, with evident expertise Florence found herself relaxing in his company. He had a gift for conversation, sharing amusing stories of cattle drives and business ventures without dominating the discussion. "And what brought you to Cottonwood Springs specifically?" Florence asked as their meal arrived. "Surely there are larger towns with more investment opportunities." Wade considered her question as he cut into his steak. "I have a nose for potential, Mrs. Miller. This valley has excellent grazing land, a reliable water source, and proximity to the expanding railroad. In 5 years' time, I predict it will be a significant cattle hub." "You sound very certain." "I've been right more often than not," he replied with a modest smile. "Though I'll admit my interest was further piqued when Jonathan Ellis mentioned a promising property that might soon be available." Florence's fork paused halfway to her mouth. "Which property?" Wade met her gaze directly. "The Miller Ranch." The blood drained from Florence's face. "My husband's ranch. But it's not for sale. According to Ellis, the bank is foreclosing due to unpaid taxes. He seemed to think it would be on the market by next week." Florence set down her fork, appetite gone. The ranch had been sold 2 months after Thomas's death to cover his gambling debts, but she had managed to keep the house in town by promising to pay the back taxes. Now even that was slipping away. "I see the news disturbs you," Wade observed quietly. "I apologize for raising an unpleasant subject." "No," Florence said, gathering her composure. "It's simply that matters are moving more quickly than I anticipated. Mr. Pinkerton from the bank visited just yesterday to inform me I have until Friday to settle the account." Wade's expression darkened. "That's very little notice." "It's 3 months' notice, in fairness," Florence admitted. "I've been struggling since Thomas passed." A silence fell between them, broken only when Wade refilled her water glass. "Mrs. Miller, Florence, if I may, would you permit me to speak plainly?" The use of her given name startled her, but she nodded. "Please do. I find myself in an unusual position. I came to Cottonwood Springs seeking business opportunities and instead found something unexpected." His blue eyes held her steadily. "I'm drawn to you in a way I can't entirely explain. Yesterday, when I saw you hiding beneath that table, something told me our paths crossing wasn't mere chance." Florence's heart fluttered traitorously. "Mr. Calloway, Wade," he corrected gently. "Wade," she amended, the name feeling intimate on her tongue. "I appreciate your candor, but we barely know each other, and my circumstances are complicated." "I understand that," he assured her. "I'm not proposing anything improper. Simply that you allow me to help with your immediate financial concerns while we become better acquainted." Florence stiffened. "I'm not looking for charity. Nor am I offering it," Wade replied, unperturbed by her pride. "I have a business proposition that might benefit us both." Despite her reservations, Florence was intrigued. "What sort of proposition?" "The Miller property has potential, but needs investment and proper management to become profitable again. I'm willing to purchase it from the bank and hire you as a consultant, given your knowledge of the land. You would receive a salary and a percentage of profits once the ranch is operating successfully." Florence stared at him, stunned by the unexpected offer. "Why would you do this?" Wade's expression softened. "Because when I pulled you out from under that table and said, 'You belong with me,' something told me it might be true in ways neither of us yet understands. I'm a businessman, Florence, but I'm also a man who recognizes when fate offers a rare opportunity." Florence lowered her gaze to the tablecloth, overwhelmed by his directness and the hope his words kindled. "I need time to consider this." "Of course," Wade agreed. "But time is one luxury you don't have much of at present. The bank expects payment by Friday. And if I accept your offer, I'll speak with Pinkerton tomorrow, settle the debt on your house, and begin negotiations for the ranch property. You'll have security, independence, and the chance to rebuild what your husband lost." It sounded too good to be true, and in Florence's experience, such offers usually were. "And what do you expect in return, Mr. Calloway?" Wade leaned back, studying her with those penetrating blue eyes. "The opportunity to court you properly, Florence. Nothing more, nothing less." The directness of his answer left her speechless. He wasn't proposing marriage to a woman he'd just met, nor was he suggesting anything dishonorable. Instead, he offered a chance to know each other without the pressure of her financial distress clouding the relationship. "You're very unconventional," she finally said. A smile curved his lips. I found conventional approaches rarely yield exceptional results. In business or in life. Florence couldn't help but return his smile. I'll have your answer tomorrow. I look forward to it. Wade signaled for the check. Now, shall we enjoy dessert? I hear the apple pie is excellent. As they shared slices of warm pie topped with fresh cream, Florence found herself studying Wade's face, trying to reconcile the businessman before her with the cowboy who had pulled her from beneath a table just yesterday. Both sides of him intrigued her, and for the first time since Thomas's death, she felt a spark of something beyond grief and worry, something that might, with time, rekindle into joy. The following morning, Florence woke early, her mind clearer than it had been in months. She had tossed and turned much of the night, weighing Wade's offer against her pride and the alternatives facing her. By dawn, she had reached her decision. After dressing in a simple blue day dress, one of the few non-mourning garments she still possessed, Florence wrote a brief note and walked to the Grand Hotel. She left the folded paper with the desk clerk, addressed to Mr. Wade Calloway, then continued to the small church at the edge of town. The church was empty at this early hour, sunlight streaming through the stained glass windows and casting colorful patterns on the worn wooden pews. Florence slipped into the last row and bowed her head, seeking not just divine guidance, but a moment of quiet reflection. Thomas had been gone 6 months now. She had mourned him properly, had kept his memory alive in their home. But she had also discovered truths about their marriage that had been hidden from her: his gambling debts, his risky investments, even rumors of a mistress in Denver. The man she had loved had kept much of himself secret from her. Now she faced a choice: continue struggling alone, likely ending up in a boarding house far from the place she'd come to call home, or accept help from a man who stirred feelings she'd thought long buried. Seeking answers, Mrs. Miller? The voice startled her. Florence looked up to find Reverend Porter standing in the aisle beside her pew, his kind face creased with concern. Just some quiet, Reverend, she replied, shifting to make room for him. The elderly minister sat beside her with a sigh. The Lord often speaks most clearly in silence. He studied her face. You seem troubled. Florence hesitated, then decided the minister's counsel might be valuable. I've been offered assistance with my financial troubles, but I'm uncertain whether accepting would be proper. Reverend Porter nodded sagely. The pride that prevents us from receiving help can sometimes be as sinful as the pride that prevents us from giving it. He paused. May I ask who has made this offer? Mr. Wade Calloway. He's new to town, the gentleman who stopped the robbery at the Silver Dollar. The Reverend interrupted, surprising Florence with his knowledge. Sheriff Taylor speaks highly of him. They say he showed remarkable courage and skill. Florence hadn't known Wade was responsible for ending the robbery. He had made no mention of it during their dinner. Mr. Calloway has proposed a business arrangement that would allow me to keep my home and work as a consultant for the ranch he wishes to purchase, she explained carefully. And does this arrangement come with expectations? Florence understood his delicate inquiry. Only the opportunity for us to become better acquainted. He wishes to court me properly. Reverend Porter's eyebrows rose. Direct, isn't he? These Texans don't waste time. A smile softened his words. Mrs. Miller, you've observed your period of mourning honorably. The good book doesn't prescribe how long a widow must wait before finding happiness again. If this man is honorable in his intentions and you feel drawn to him, perhaps this is the Lord's way of opening a new chapter in your life. His words resonated with something Florence had been feeling but couldn't articulate. Thank you, Reverend. I believe I have my answer. She left the church with a lighter heart, her steps purposeful as she headed toward the bank. If Wade had received her note, he would meet her there at 10 o'clock. Florence arrived at the bank precisely on time to find Wade already waiting outside, his tall figure drawing glances from passers-by. He wore riding clothes today, dark trousers, a crisp white shirt, and a finely tooled leather vest that spoke of quality without ostentation. His expression brightened when he spotted her. Good morning, Florence, he greeted her, removing his hat. I received your note. Thank you for coming, she replied, suddenly nervous now that the moment of decision was upon her. Before we go inside, I need to be absolutely clear about something. Wade nodded, his blue eyes attentive. If I accept your help, it must be a legitimate business arrangement, Florence stated firmly. I won't be beholden to you, or anyone else again. I need your word that your interest in me won't affect the terms of our agreement." A slow smile spread across Wade's face. "You have my word as a gentleman and a businessman. The arrangement stands regardless of how our personal acquaintance develops." He extended his hand. "Partners." Florence took his hand, feeling the strength and warmth of his grip. "Partners." They entered the bank together, causing Horatio Pinkerton to look up from his ledger with obvious surprise. His gaze traveled from Florence to Wade and back again, curiosity and calculation evident in his expression. "Mrs. Miller," he greeted her. "Mr. Calloway, what can I do for you today?" Wade stepped forward, his manner shifting subtly from the warm courtesy he showed Florence to the confident authority of a businessman. "Mr. Pinkerton, I understand Mrs. Miller has until Friday to settle her property taxes." Pinkerton adjusted his spectacles nervously. "That is correct." "I'd like to pay that amount in full today," Wade stated, reaching into his jacket for his wallet. "And I'd also like to discuss acquiring the Miller Ranch property." Pinkerton's eyebrows shot up. The ranch was sold to cover Mr. Miller's debts, but the new owner might be persuaded to sell for the right price. "Then I suggest you arrange a meeting," Wade replied smoothly. "In the meantime, let's settle Mrs. Miller's account." Florence watched in amazement as Wade counted out the exact amount she owed, a sum that had seemed insurmountable to her just yesterday. Pinkerton wrote out a receipt with barely concealed disappointment, clearly having hoped to acquire her house for the bank. "Mrs. Miller will be acting as my consultant regarding the ranch property," Wade informed Pinkerton as they concluded their business. "Any further communications about the matter should include her." The banker's expression soured further. "As you wish, Mr. Calloway." Outside the bank, Florence exhaled deeply, feeling as though a great weight had lifted from her shoulders. "I don't know how to thank you." "No thanks necessary," Wade assured her. "This is business." His eyes twinkled. "The pleasure of your company is a separate matter entirely." Florence couldn't help but smile at his forthright manner. "Well, as your new business consultant, I suggest we visit the ranch today. I can show you the property boundaries and water sources." "An excellent suggestion," Wade agreed. "I've taken the liberty of arranging for horses. Would you prefer to change into riding attire first?" Florence hesitated. She had sold her riding habit months ago. "I'm afraid I don't have suitable clothes anymore." Understanding dawned in Wade's eyes. "Then we'll take the buggy instead. More conducive to conversation anyway." An hour later, they were traveling along the dusty road that led out of town toward what had once been the Miller Ranch. Florence felt a complex mixture of emotions as familiar landmarks came into view: the lightning-struck oak that marked the turn to the property, the rolling hills where Thomas had planned to expand their herds, the distant outline of the ranch house where she had begun her married life. "It's beautiful country," Wade observed, taking in the sweeping vistas of grassland backed by the distant mountains. "It is," Florence agreed. Thomas had grand plans for this place, but never quite managed to make them reality. "Why do you think that was?" Florence considered the question carefully. "He loved the idea of ranching more than the work itself, I think. He was always chasing the next opportunity instead of building on what we had." Wade nodded thoughtfully as he guided the buggy down the rutted drive toward the ranch house. A common failing. Many see the romance of the West without recognizing the grit required to survive here. The house came fully into view, a sturdy two-story structure built of local timber and stone. It looked neglected but not dilapidated, with empty flower boxes beneath the windows where Florence had once grown petunias and sweet peas. "No one's living here?" Wade asked, noting the absence of smoke from the chimney or any signs of occupation. "The bank has been trying to sell it since foreclosure," Florence explained. "There was a caretaker for a while, but I believe he left when funds ran short." They pulled up before the house, and Wade secured the horses before helping Florence down from the buggy. Standing on the ground where she had once intended to spend her life, Florence felt a curious blend of nostalgia and detachment. "Would you like to go inside?" Wade asked gently. Florence nodded. The door key used to be kept. She stopped herself, realizing such information was likely no longer relevant. "We might have to break in." Wade grinned, a flash of the cowboy beneath the businessman's exterior. "Or we could try the latch first." He mounted the porch steps and tried the door handle, which turned easily in his grip. Seems security wasn't a priority. The interior of the house was cool and dusty, sunlight streaming through unwashed windows to illuminate the sparse furnishings that remained. Florence moved through the rooms like a ghost, memories surfacing with each step, setting up housekeeping as a new bride, nursing Thomas through a winter illness, receiving the news of his death in the very parlor where she now stood. "You love this place," Wade observed, watching her trail her fingers along the mantelpiece. "I loved what I thought it could become," Florence corrected him. "A home, a legacy." She sighed. Thomas made it seem so possible. Wade moved to stand beside her. "It still could be those things." Florence turned to face him, struck again by the quiet confidence he exuded. "Do you really believe that?" "I do," Wade replied simply. "With proper management and investment, this could be one of the finest ranches in the territory." His gaze held hers. "And a home worth returning to each day." The implication in his words wasn't lost on Florence. This man she barely knew was offering her not just financial security, but a vision of a future she had thought lost forever. "You move very quickly, Mr. Calloway," she said, trying to mask her emotional response with formality. A smile touched his lips. "Life's too short for hesitation, Mrs. Miller. When I see something worth pursuing, I don't waste time." They continued their tour of the property, Florence pointing out the good grazing areas, the year-round spring that provided water even in drought years, and the stands of timber that had been Thomas's pride. Wade listened attentively, asking insightful questions that revealed his extensive knowledge of ranching operations. By the time they returned to the buggy, the sun was high overhead, and Wade suggested they stop for the picnic lunch he had presciently arranged to have packed for them. They found a shady spot beneath a cottonwood tree near the spring, where Wade spread a blanket and unpacked sandwiches, cold chicken, and a bottle of lemonade. "You think of everything," Florence remarked as she settled on the blanket, conscious of how comfortable she already felt in his company. "Not everything," Wade admitted, handing her a sandwich. "But I try to anticipate needs when I can." As they ate, Wade shared more about his background growing up on his family's ranch near San Antonio, learning the cattle business from his father, expanding into investments after his parents' deaths. He spoke with affection of his younger sister, married to a banker in St. Louis, and his foreman, Francisco, who had been with the family since Wade was a boy. "And what about you?" he asked eventually. What did Florence Miller dream of before life took an unexpected turn? The question caught her off guard. It had been so long since anyone had asked about her hopes rather than her needs or circumstances. "I wanted to teach," she admitted. "My aunt couldn't afford to send me to normal school, so I learned as much as I could from books. Thomas promised I could start a small school on the ranch once we were established, for the children of our workers and neighbors." "A noble ambition," Wade said, genuine respect in his voice. "And not an impossible one still." Florence smiled wistfully. "Perhaps. Though at 23, I sometimes feel as though my life has already been decided for me." 23. Wade looked surprised. "I would have guessed older, given your composure." "And you, Mr. Calloway? How many years of experience inform your business acumen?" 32 last month, he replied with a grin. "Old enough to know better about most things, young enough to still make the occasional rash decision. Like offering to help a widow you met under a table." Florence ventured, her tone light despite the seriousness of the question. Wade's eyes held her steadily. "That might be my best decision yet." The warmth in his gaze made Florence glance away, suddenly aware of how isolated they were and how quickly her reserve was melting in his presence. She began gathering the remains of their picnic, needing a moment to collect herself. "We should head back soon," she said. "People will talk if we're gone too long." Wade helped her pack the basket, but made no move to leave immediately. "Florence," he said quietly, "may I ask you something personal?" She nodded, though apprehension fluttered in her stomach. "Were you happy in your marriage?" The directness of the question startled her. No one had ever asked her that, assuming that as a grieving widow, she must have adored her husband. "I was content," she answered carefully. "Thomas was charming and ambitious. He took care of me in his way." "That's not the same as happiness," Wade observed. "No," Florence agreed softly. "It isn't." They stood in silence for a moment, the gravity of her admission hanging between them. Then Wade offered his hand to help her rise, and they walked back to the buggy together, something unspoken but profound shifting in their understanding of each other. The ride back to town was quieter, both lost in their own thoughts. As they approached Florence's house, Wade finally broke the silence. "I'll be negotiating for the ranch over the next few days," he said. "I'd like you to join me for those discussions, as my consultant." "Of course," Florence agreed, "though I doubt Mr. Pinkerton will appreciate my presence." Wade's expression hardened slightly. "Pinkerton's appreciation isn't my concern. Your knowledge of the property is valuable, and I want him and everyone else to understand that you have a stake in these negotiations." Florence felt a rush of gratitude for his consideration. "Thank you for that." He helped her down from the buggy in front of her house, holding her hand perhaps a moment longer than strictly necessary. "Would you do me the honor of dining with me again tomorrow evening? We can discuss our strategy for the negotiations." "I'd like that," Florence replied, surprising herself with how genuinely she meant it. As Wade drove away, Florence entered her house with a lighter step than she'd had in months. For the first time since Thomas's death, she felt something beyond survival was possible, something that might even resemble happiness. The next 2 weeks passed in a whirlwind of activity that transformed Florence's circumstances with breathtaking speed. Wade successfully negotiated the purchase of the Miller Ranch, driving a hard bargain that left Pinkerton and the bank's directors begrudgingly respectful of his business acumen. True to his word, he formalized Florence's position as a consultant with a generous salary and profit-sharing agreement that would ensure her independence regardless of how their personal relationship developed. Work began immediately on restoring the ranch to working condition. Wade hired local men to repair fences and outbuildings, sent for a small herd of prime breeding stock from his Texas holdings, and commissioned improvements to the ranch house itself. Throughout it all, he sought Florence's input, valuing her knowledge of the property and respecting her vision for its development. Their business partnership quickly developed into something deeper. Each evening, they would dine together, sometimes at the hotel, other times at Florence's house, where she discovered a joy in cooking for someone who appreciated her efforts. Wade was attentive without being possessive, respectful of her independence, while making his growing affection clear. For Florence, the transformation was as internal as it was external. The cloud of grief and anxiety that had enveloped her since Thomas's death began to lift, replaced by a cautious optimism about the future. She found herself laughing again, making plans that extended beyond mere survival, and most surprisingly looking forward to each moment spent in Wade's company. The town of Cottonwood Springs watched this developing relationship with mixed reactions. Some, like Reverend Porter, expressed genuine pleasure at seeing the young widow finding happiness again. Others, particularly those who had designs on either Florence or her property, were less enthusiastic. Gossip inevitably followed them, but Wade's reputation as the hero who had stopped the saloon robbery and his obvious respect for Florence in public helped silence the worst of it. 3 weeks after their first meeting, Wade invited Florence to ride out to the ranch with him to see the progress. The spring day was perfect, clear blue skies, wildflowers dotting the grasslands, and a gentle breeze carrying the scent of pine from the distant mountains. "The place is really coming along," Florence observed as they approached on horseback. Wade had insisted on buying her a proper riding habit, and she had to admit the freedom of being on her own mount rather than in a buggy was exhilarating. The ranch house gleamed with fresh paint, the flower boxes Florence had once tended now replanted with colorful blooms. Men worked in the distance, repairing corrals and stringing new fencing. Smoke rose from the chimney, indicating that the caretaker Wade had hired was in residence. "Wait until you see inside," Wade said, his eyes alight with boyish excitement as he helped her dismount. The interior of the house had been transformed. The floors gleamed with polish, new curtains hung at the windows, and the parlor had been furnished with comfortable, high-quality pieces that somehow matched Florence's taste exactly. "How did you know?" she asked, running her hand along a bookshelf filled with volumes she would have chosen herself. Wade looked pleased by her reaction. "I might have consulted Mrs. Henderson at the millinery. She seems to know everyone's preferences in town." "It's wonderful," Florence said sincerely. "But why go to such trouble for a property you'll only visit occasionally?" Wade's expression grew serious. "That's something I wanted to discuss with you today." He gestured for her to sit on the new sofa while he remained standing, a hint of nervousness in his normally confident demeanor. "Florence," he began, "these past weeks have been the most rewarding of my life, both professionally and personally. Working with you, getting to know you, it's made me reconsider many things." Florence's heart quickened at his tone. "What things?" "My priorities. My future." Wade took a deep breath. "I came to Colorado looking for a business opportunity and found something far more valuable. I found you." He moved to sit beside her, taking her hands in his. "I know it's soon, probably too soon by conventional standards. But I've never been conventional, and life has taught me not to waste time when something truly matters." Florence could scarcely breathe as Wade continued. "I'm not asking for an immediate answer, but I want you to know my intentions. I love you, Florence Miller. I believe I started falling in love the moment I pulled you out from under that table and told you that you belonged with me." Tears pricked at Florence's eyes. "Wade, please," he said gently, "let me finish. I want to court you properly, for as long as you need. And when you're ready, if you ever feel ready, I want to make this house our home, together, not as business partners, but as husband and wife." The words hung in the air between them, momentous and transformative. Florence searched his face, finding nothing but sincerity in those blue eyes that had captivated her from the start. "I've been cautious," she admitted softly. "After Thomas, I promised myself I wouldn't rush into anything, wouldn't depend on anyone again." Wade nodded, patient and understanding. "But with you," Florence continued, "everything feels different. You've never asked me to be less than I am. You've only encouraged me to be more." She squeezed his hands, gathering courage. "I'm not ready to marry again yet. I need time. But I do love you, Wade Calloway. I love your directness, your integrity, your kindness. And I believe that one day, perhaps sooner than either of us might expect, I'll be ready to make this house our home." The joy that spread across Wade's face was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. He raised her hands to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles. "That's all I could hope for." Florence smiled through her tears. "You know, most men would have kissed me properly by now." Wade's eyes darkened with emotion. "I was trying to be a gentleman." "Sometimes," Florence murmured, leaning closer, "a gentleman knows when traditional courtship needs adaptation." Taking her cue, Wade cupped her face in his hands and kissed her with a tenderness that made her heart soar. It was a beginning kiss, a promise kiss, one that spoke of patience and passion in equal measure. When they finally parted, Florence rested her forehead against his. "When you pulled me from under that table and said I belonged with you, I thought you were just being kind to a frightened woman." Wade smiled, stroking her cheek with his thumb. "I was being kind, but I was also stating a truth I somehow already knew. You do belong with me, Florence, and I belong with you." As the afternoon sun streamed through the windows of what would one day be their home, Florence Miller knew with absolute certainty that the shame that had driven her to hide beneath a table had led her to the greatest blessing of her life, a man who saw her courage rather than her fear, her strength rather than her vulnerability, and who wanted to build a future in which they could face whatever came, together. 6 months later, on a crisp autumn day with leaves turning gold in the cottonwood trees, Florence Miller became Florence Calloway in a simple ceremony at the Cottonwood Springs Church. Reverend Porter officiated, beaming with approval as the couple exchanged vows before a gathering of friends and new acquaintances. Florence wore a gown of ivory silk with delicate pearl beading, not white, out of respect for her first marriage, but not somber either, in recognition of the joy she'd found with Wade. Her dark hair was crowned with a wreath of late blooming wildflowers gathered from the ranch that morning. Wade, resplendent in a new black suit with a silver brocade vest, couldn't take his eyes off his bride. When he lifted her veil to seal their vows with a kiss, those who witnessed it later remarked that they'd never seen two people more perfectly matched or more evidently in love. The celebration moved to the ranch afterward, where tables had been set up beneath the cottonwood trees and lanterns hung in preparation for evening. The ranch hands and townspeople mingled easily, differences forgotten in the spirit of the occasion. Even Horatio Pinkerton attended, his congratulations stiff but sincere now that the Calloway Ranch was becoming one of the most successful operations in the county. As dusk fell and fiddle music filled the air, Wade led Florence in their first dance as husband and wife. "Happy, Mrs. Calloway," he murmured, holding her close as they swayed beneath the stars. Completely, Florence replied, her eyes shining with a contentment that 6 months earlier she would have thought impossible. Though I still can't quite believe how much has changed since that day in the saloon. Wade smiled, spinning her gently. Sometimes the most unexpected beginnings lead to the most perfect endings. Not an ending, Florence corrected him. A beginning. Later that night, after the guests had departed and they were alone in the beautifully restored ranch house, their home now in truth, as well as intention, Wade carried Florence across the threshold of the master bedroom with tender reverence. "I have something for you," he said, setting her down carefully before retrieving a small package from his dresser drawer. Florence unwrapped it to find a silver-framed daguerreotype of the two of them, taken in Denver during a business trip the previous month. They were seated side by side, Wade's hand covering hers, both smiling with evident happiness. "Our first portrait as a couple," Wade explained. "I thought we might start a collection to mark our journey together." Tears of happiness welled in Florence's eyes as she placed the frame on the bedside table. "It's perfect. Thank you." Wade drew her into his arms, his expression growing serious. "I want you to know something, Florence. When I found you that day, hiding under that table, I meant what I said, that you belonged with me. But what I've come to realize is that I belong with you just as much. You've given my life a purpose beyond business success. You've made this house a home in ways I never imagined possible." Florence reached up to touch his face, her heart full to bursting. "We found each other when we both needed it most. Some might call it chance, but I prefer to think it was providence." "Providence, indeed," Wade agreed, lowering his lips to hers. As moonlight streamed through the bedroom window, casting silver patterns across the quilt Florence had lovingly restored for their marriage bed, two lives that had intersected by chance in a moment of danger merged completely in love, trust, and the promise of a future neither had dared to imagine before finding each other. 5 years later, the Calloway Ranch had become exactly what Florence and Wade had envisioned: a thriving enterprise that employed dozens of local men and women, produced some of the finest cattle in Colorado Territory, and served as a gathering place for the community of Cottonwood Springs, which had grown substantially with the completion of the railroad spur Wade had helped finance. The ranch house had expanded to accommodate their growing family. 3-year-old Thomas Wade Calloway, named for both Florence's first husband and his father, was the spitting image of Wade with his dark hair and startling blue eyes. His baby sister, Elizabeth Grace, born just 6 months earlier, had Florence's warm brown eyes and sweet temperament. But perhaps the most meaningful addition to the property was the small schoolhouse Wade had built for Florence's 28th birthday. What had begun as a place for her to teach the children of their ranch hands had grown into a proper school serving families for miles around. Watching his wife in her element, sharing her love of learning with eager young minds, filled Wade with a pride that surpassed even his considerable business accomplishments. On a warm summer evening, as the children slept under the watchful eye of their nanny, Florence and Wade sat on the wide porch of their home, watching the sunset paint the distant mountains in shades of purple and gold. Wade's arm rested comfortably around his wife's shoulders, her head leaning against him in familiar contentment. "Do you ever think about that day?" Florence asked softly. "The robbery at the saloon?" Wade smiled, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Often. Best day of my life, finding you under that table." Florence laughed. "It certainly wasn't my finest moment." "It was perfect," Wade disagreed. "You were perfect, all dignity despite your circumstances. I knew right then you were exceptional. And I thought you were either mad or the most forward man I'd ever encountered," Florence admitted with a grin. "Pulling me out and declaring I belonged with you." Wade's expression grew tender. "I meant every word. Still do." Florence turned in his embrace to face him, her eyes reflecting the love that had only deepened with each passing year. "As do I. We belong together, Wade Calloway. Always have, always will." As the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, their lips met in a kiss that held the comfort of familiarity and the enduring spark of passion. From an inauspicious beginning beneath a saloon table to a life richer than either had dared to dream, their journey together was proof that sometimes the most unexpected meeting could lead to the most perfect match. And in the years that followed, as their children grew and the ranch prospered, Whenever anyone asked how they had met, Wade would always begin the story the same way. Well, I found this beautiful widow hiding under a table. And Florence would finish with a smile. And he pulled me out and told me I belonged with him. Turns out, he was right.